Gilbert Paul Jordan, who also went by the nickname the Boozing Barber, because of his strong addiction to alcohol. Jordan is considered a serial killer, as he was linked to the deaths of at least 8 to 10 women between 1965 and 1987, and attempted to kill at least 4 more women before police intervened. However, he was only ever convicted of the manslaughter death of 1 woman. So how could this happen? How could he be involved in so many deaths, yet never serve any time? Well, his weapon of choice was ethyl alcohol, and his victims were Aboriginal alcoholic women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside. Before we dive into today's chilling tale, take a moment to comment below where you're watching from, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification button so you never miss another gripping unknown crime story. Jordan would kill his victims by bribing them with cash to drink a deadly overdose, and the slayings were referred to as the alcohol murders by some in the media. Typically, he would find women in bars, he would buy them drinks, he would pay them for sacks, and then he would encourage them to drink with him. And when they passed out, he would pour liquor down their throats. The deaths were reported as alcohol poisoning, and the police were indifferent because some of his victims were alcoholics. Although the newspapers often described the women as prostitutes, not all were involved in prostitution. Gilbert Paul was born on December 12, 1931 to Winifred and Jack Elsey in Vancouver. He was born as Gilbert Paul Elsey, but later changed his name to Jordan. I'll touch more on that later. Gilbert was the second oldest of 3 boys. He had an older brother named Bud and a younger brother named Robert. So Jack worked several labor jobs before finally taking a job working for the Royal Bank of Canada. And his interest in finance would also be shared by his son. Gilbert Winifred was an assertive woman and a devout Methodist. She and Jack would eventually have an amicable divorce, and both eventually remarried other people and started new families. The boys lived with Jack so they could attend familiar schools, but also because Jack earned more money than Winifred, who worked as a sales clerk. Years later, in an article published in the Vancouver Sunday November 4, 2000, Bud Elsey expressed that he had a hard time understanding how his brother ended up the way he did. Bud said that there wasn't any abuse in the family and that they had a very normal childhood, and that there was nothing in his background that could possibly explain Gilbert Paul's murderous behavior as a child. Gilbert Paul did have some difficulty making friends, and his classmates thought he was antisocial because he was short and stocky. His classmates would sometimes call him Chubbs or Chubby. Both nicknames said he hated them. Gilbert Paul would drop out of school at the age of 16, and began drinking heavily around Vancouver's West End, often remaining intoxicated for days. His mother, Winifred, was appalled by her son's drinking and refused to have anything to do with him and wouldn't take his calls. When he was intoxicated, Gilbert Paul Elsey had a ravenous appetite for both booze and drunken sex. Soon he would be drinking over 50 ounces of vodka per day, and not surprisingly, his drinking companions were usually also alcoholics. Gilbert Paul's life soon began to spiral downhill. Although he had a passion for cars and began to do body work on vehicles, he couldn't seem to stay sober long enough to make a living in this field. He did travel to Los Angeles at one time in 1949 to try and make a living in this industry, but failed and returned to Canada shortly thereafter. Gilbert Paul began taking odd jobs, but they barely helped him to scrape by. His drinking increased, and it was around this time he started breaking the law. Death was his crime of choice at first. He began with smaller items and eventually worked up to stealing cars. He was first convicted of auto theft when he was only 18. He would be sentenced to 12 months in jail by 1952. His criminal record included theft, assault, heroin possession, and car theft. Between 1952 and 1960, he was charged 6 more times for theft-related offenses and was convicted of 4. For 2 of those convictions, Gilbert Paul would be sentenced to 12 months in prison each time. In 1961, the RCMP found Gilbert Paul in his car in a gravel pit, alone with a 5-year-old Indigenous girl. Gilbert had taken her from a reserve in Mission, British Columbia, but further details from the incident are not known. Even though the girl was found alone in his car far away from the reserve, the Crown didn't go forward with charges. A stay of proceedings ended the trial. Apparently because of the girl's young age, her ability as a reliable witness was questioned. In early December 1961, Gilbert Paul was charged and convicted again for theft. Then later that month, while heavily intoxicated, he stopped traffic on the Lions Gate Bridge by threatening to jump off of it. He was charged, and then the Crown changed their mind and later withdrew the charges related to that little episode. But he ended up spending 2 months in Riverview Mental Hospital in Coquitlam, British Columbia. In March of 1963, shortly after he was eventually let go from the mental hospital, Gilbert Paul picked up 2 women from Vancouver's downtown east side of Hastings Street in Maine, also known as Vancouver's Skid Row. The bars on Skid Row were often hangouts for heavy drinkers and drug addicts, so Jordan didn't really look out of place. But he didn't attract attention either. The three of them got drunk together in a car near Cole Harbor. One of the women would eventually get out of the car because she was feeling ill from drinking too much vodka. When this happened, Gilbert drove off with her purse and the other woman passed out beside him. He took the woman to a secluded area in North Vancouver where he would eventually sexually assault her. The woman did report this incident to the police, and he was arrested and charged with sexual assault and theft. So I'm not sure if his defense was just to act as crazy as possible and hope the charges would be dropped, because as he walked into court, he yelled at the judge. Arthur Poole clicked his heels together and made a straight-armed Nazi salute. Needless to say, the judge was not amused by this performance, and he ended up earning another 6 months in jail, this time for contempt of court. He was assessed by a psychiatrist during this time before his trial, and the doctor found him to be mentally ill, but there doesn't seem to be an official diagnosis on record. Gilbert Paul ended up being acquitted of the sexual assault charges when the court found that the alleged victim was too intoxicated to remember what had taken place in the car. He was, however, convicted of 2 counts of theft over $50 for driving off with the other woman's purse, and he was sentenced to 2 years in prison for each offense. He was later released after his convictions were overturned on appeal. While he was in prison, he learned how to cut hair and would eventually open the Slow Can Barbershop on Kingsway Avenue. With his new profession and his love of alcohol, he earned the nickname the Boozing Barber. Soon the Boozing Barber would progress from theft to murder. The first woman known to have died by alcohol poisoning while in Jordan's presence was in 1965. On the morning of January 18, 1965, a housekeeper at the Lyle Hotel in Vancouver found the nude body of an English-born switchboard operator named Ivy Rose Oswald. Gilbert and Ivy had checked in the night before together, and a pathologist had found Ivy's blood alcohol content to be a whopping 0.51. However, she was not known to be a heavy drinker, and somehow she managed to surpass the level where death can occur from alcohol poisoning. For example, a blood alcohol content between 0.16 and 0.3 would cause the average person to lose consciousness. Death by alcohol poisoning occurs around 0.4. The legal driving limit is 0.8. Chugging 12 beers at once would result in a blood alcohol content of 0.3, the point where a person usually blacks out to die of alcohol poisoning. A person usually has to consume a lot of alcohol very quickly. Ivy's autopsy also revealed superficial wounds and a few bruises on her lips, chin and scalp, but at the time, these were ignored and seen as unrelated to her death. Gilbert was brought in for questioning and he was held at the city jail while police investigated the incident. He had a few of Ivy's possessions with him when he was brought in for questioning, proving that he had been with her the night before. Gilbert ended up confessing to the police that he had been with her the night before. The two of them had been drinking together, they had sex, and he claims that he found her deceased in the morning. Ivy Rose's death was ruled an accident and would remain that way until 1987. The police would then release Gilbert Paul Jordan without any charges laid against him. Her murder was the beginning of a series of killings, and Jordan managed to escape being arrested. Only 4 days after Oswald's death, Gilbert applied to have his last name changed from Elsie to Jordan. His brother Bud later told the Vancouver Sun in an October 22, 1988 interview that his brother changed his last name because of the embarrassment his crimes were causing the family. The new last name didn't change Gilbert Paul Jordan's criminal behavior. If anything, he seemed to grow more confident as a criminal, and his crimes increased. Between 1960 and 1971, he would be charged with 18 different offenses that included theft, assault, drunk driving, heroin possession, and indecent acts. 2 of the drunk driving charges he managed to accumulate on the same day. For most of his other crimes, though, the Crown often had to drop the charges against him due to Gilbert Paul Jordan knew how to manipulate the system and got away with a lot. In 1971, Gilbert Paul Jordan moved to northern BC to the town of Prince George and began dating a woman named Renata. He would get married for a brief time in 1972, but this wouldn't stop his criminal activity. Their marriage was really kind of doomed from the start. During their first year together, Gilbert was convicted of 3 different sexual offenses. The first was in April 1971, when 41-year-old Gilbert invited a group of local school children back to his house to watch television and exposed himself to them. From late 1973 to 1975, Gilbert Paul Jordan was convicted of many sex-related offenses and others associated with violence and alcohol. In April 1973, at the age of 42, he was convicted of indecent exposure after he exposed himself to a group of schoolchildren in Mackenzie, BC. After serving another short amount of time in prison, Jordan would then return to Prince George. In October 1975, he offered a woman a ride and then attempted to sexually assault her. Fortunately, a witness who heard the woman screaming intervened and prevented the assault. Gilbert's impulsive and aggressive behavior wasn't just for random attacks on strangers. He was also allegedly extremely abusive to Renata throughout their marriage. She was admitted to the hospital once in 1973 and twice in 1974, but refused to say what had happened to her. After a hospital stay in 1974, Renata's doctors noticed that her husband was making threatening phone calls to the hospital, ordering that his wife be charged. Fortunately, his requests were denied. Due to his aggressive behavior around hospital staff, Gilbert was forbidden from visiting his wife. Oh my God. If he wasn't such a horrible person, I think he'd be quite funny. He actually dressed in disguise and tried to sneak into the hospital to break her out. Fortunately, this turned out to be a complete failure. Gilbert was quickly recognized and apprehended by hospital security, and Renata was allowed to continue healing in peace. This break from him to gather her strength turned out to be a good thing, because in October in 1975, Renata decided she was done. She wanted out of this thing. She requested a police escort to take her to the airport, where she boarded a plane for California, hoping that she would never have to talk to this horrible person ever again. But in a desperate attempt to keep her in Canada, Gilbert called in a bomb threat to Renata's plane. He was quickly apprehended by authorities and charged with endangering the safety of an aircraft in flight. However, because the plane never actually took off, Gilbert successfully appealed the charge. Gilbert finished off 1975 with another sexual assault. In December, he met a woman outside a Prince George liquor store. He then offered her a ride, and the woman would come back to his home with him, where they drank heavily together. The woman passed out but fortunately came to. Jordan attempted to sexually assault her in his bathroom. She was fortunately able to escape, but not before Jordan beat and choked her. Jordan was convicted of the October and December assaults and sentenced to 2 years less a day for each crime. The sentence for the first assault ended up being appealed and was reduced to 6 months. The Crown then decided to try him as a dangerous offender because of his chronic and increasingly violent behaviors. So in Canada, we don't have the death penalty or life without parole as options. We just have life, and then people have the opportunity to apply for parole after 25 years. However, there is a small loophole. If somebody is convicted and is beyond redemption, the Crown can apply for what's called dangerous offender status. And this dangerous offender status is pretty much reserved for the most violent. Famous example of someone who's been declared a dangerous offender is Paul Bernardo. So Crown attorneys can seek dangerous offender status during the sentencing phase, and they must show that there is a high risk that the offender will commit violent or sexual offenses in the future. This designation carries an automatic sentence of imprisonment for an indeterminate period, with no chance of parole for 7 years. Dangerous offenders can apply for parole after 7 years, but the indeterminate sentence usually equals a life sentence. Very few dangerous offenders are ever released, and this is because they've committed violent and sexual offenses and they just can't control themselves when they're released into the community. It's almost impossible for dangerous offenders to ever get parole because the purpose of the legislation in the first place is to detain offenders that are deemed too dangerous for society, but whose sentences would not necessarily keep them incarcerated under other legislation. If someone who is a dangerous offender were fortunate enough to be granted parole, they would remain under supervision indefinitely, which pretty much means probation for the rest of your life. There have been 735 dangerous offender designations since 1978, the year the category was created. There are currently 565 dangerous offenders. 541 are in custody, leaving only 24 on release. Which brings me back to Gilbert Paul Jordan. A string of expert witnesses testified for the prosecution, and they strongly felt that Gilbert was a high risk to reoffend. But in the end, the court denied the Crown's dangerous offender application and Gilbert Paul Jordan was free to offend once again. In 175, the boozing Barber was back on the street when he should have remained behind bars. 2 months later, Gilbert was arrested for indecent exposure in Cold Lake, Alberta. A month after that, he committed another shocking crime. During this year, he abducted and sexually assaulted a woman from a mental institution who was 47 years old but had the mental capacity of a child. Gilbert convinced her he was a doctor and coaxed her into his car. He sped off to a hotel in Alberta where he beat her and sexually assaulted her, then stole her jewelry from her body. After surviving for 3 days on nothing but vodka, He then forced her back into the car and headed west. At some point, he pulled over and tried to sexually assault her again. But passing police officers noted the parked vehicle and decided to check it out by shining their lights into Gilbert's car. They immediately noticed the empty liquor bottles all over the floor of Gilbert's car. They also noticed that the woman sitting beside him in the car had bruises and scratches all over her body. Gilbert claimed that she had fallen, but she ended up speaking up and told the officers the truth that he had beat her. Police charged him on several counts, including sexual assault and kidnapping. He pleaded guilty to assault, and he was sentenced to 26 months in prison. The Crown ended up dropping the charges in exchange for a guilty plea of assault. In 1976, Jordan was examined by a psychologist named Dr. Tibor Bezzaretti. Dr. Bezzaretti diagnosed Jordan as having antisocial personality disorder. In April of 1979, 47-year-old Gilbert Paul Jordan was allowed to walk free after 2 years in police custody. After he served his time in jail, he returned to Vancouver and his criminal activity accelerated. He would also learn that during this time in custody, he had accumulated enough wealth to start a new life. While in prison, he received a small inheritance from a family member, and thanks to the help of a broker, Gilbert invested the money in the stock market. So although he spent a lot of time on Vancouver's Skid Row, he wasn't hurting for money. Considering his years of alcoholism, Gilbert Paul Jordan was actually quite well off. This also explains how he was able to defend his multiple arrests that he accumulated over the years. Gilbert Paul Jordan had managed to save up enough money to purchase his own barbershop. In the 1980s, he would open the Slogan Barbershop in Vancouver's downtown Eastside, and this would also be the site where he would start his newest crime spree. He would buy loads of alcohol and then tempt vulnerable alcoholic women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside to come back to his barbershop to party with him. Friends of his would say that he would tell them that women loved him, which they knew better. Women were around because of the money and the free alcohol supply. He would also brag about having sex with as many as 200 women per year. But no one seemed to think it was suspicious that some of the women that he was drinking with turned up dead. The police failed to see a connection to Jordan until it was entirely far too late. At some point in 1980, he met Mary Johnson. The exact nature of their relationship is unclear, but we do know that it didn't end very well for Mary. During the last week of November, Mary made a disturbing phone call to her sister-in-law. She told her sister-in-law Lavanna Gentry that she was afraid somebody wanted her dead. But when Lavanna asked for more details, Mary wouldn't elaborate. Lavanna thought Mary was acting a bit paranoid. Still, she told Mary to call her again if she really felt like her life was in danger. 1 week later, Mary was dead. On November 30th, 1980, Mary Johnson, age 42, died in Jordan's company at the Elmer Hotel. Her blood alcohol content was 0.3. Police quickly came to the conclusion that it was either a suicide or an accident. The only issue with this was the phone call Mary had made to her sister-in-law. Police listened to Lavanna, but dismissed her concerns. There was no evidence of foul play in the hotel room or on Mary's body. Authorities ruled Mary's cause of death as unnatural and accidental. Unfortunately, less than a year later, authorities would find themselves using that exact same excuse to describe another death. In September of 1981, 27-year-old Barbara and Paul would be found dead in the Glen Eyre Hotel. She had a blood alcohol content of 0.41. Barbara at times was employed as a sex worker, and she was a reported alcoholic as well. The police ruled her death as unnatural and accidental due to alcohol poisoning. No one even suspected murder. It was clear the authorities weren't even aware of Gilbert's involvement. There was no immediate evidence of another person's presence in either of the victims' hotel rooms, and the deaths occurred about a year apart in completely different cities. But looking back at the similarities between Barbara and Mary's death, there were clear indicators of Gilbert's MO. Both were Indigenous women, both were known to drink heavily on their own, and both were found dead without a scratch on them. On July 30th, 1982, Mary Doris John died while drinking with Jordan at his Kingsway barbershop. Mary was an Indigenous woman who recently left the Yukon Territory after the death of her son. The next morning, Gilbert stood over Mary's body with his telephone in his hand. He called his lawyer and explained in a panic that he had been drinking with a friend and she seemed to have ingested too much. Gilbert's lawyer advised him to call the police. If it was truly an accident, he had nothing to worry about. Gilbert hung up the phone and looked at Mary, who was lying face down on a foam mattress. Of course, Mary's death wasn't an accident at all. Her blood alcohol content was an insane 0.76, according to the coroner. That this was enough to kill a small woman 2 times over. I'm still stunned that the authorities thought that this woman was capable of drinking that much. Once she hit 0.3%, someone her size would have passed out. But as difficult as it was to assume that Mary had drunk herself to death, apparently it was even more difficult to assume that she had been murdered. As far as anyone in the area knew, nobody had ever killed someone by forcing alcohol down their throat. And it seemed like a crazy idea to assume that anyone would even try. Gilbert was a master manipulator. He put on quite the performance for the police. As a man who just happened to wake up beside a dead body. He was so convincing, in fact, that authorities didn't even check to see if he had a criminal record. So when Gilbert insisted that Mary's death had simply been an unfortunate accident, authorities believed he was telling the truth. Police closed the case and ruled the death as accidental. Once again, Gilbert went free. Law enforcement didn't even really seem to notice that women were turning up dead. After spending time with Gilbert Paul Jordan, they concluded that the deaths were a result of a high-risk lifestyle. They didn't even consider that Jordan might be a serial killer. Jordan briefly stopped killing in 1983 when he fell in love and married a woman named Maria Elvira. But his drunkenness, infidelity, and abuse led Maria to flee after only 4 months of marriage. Undeterred by his brief, failed marriage, Jordan picked up quickly where he left off, and women continued to turn up dead after spending time with him. Patricia Thomas, age 40, died at the barber shop on December 14, 1984, during one of Jordan's parties. Her blood alcohol content was a fatal 0.51. Patricia's body showed injuries that had occurred close to the time of her death. Investigators determined her injuries were a result of falling while intoxicated, and her death was once again found to be an accidental overdose. Gilbert already knew what steps to take to ensure his freedom. He would call his lawyer and spin a false tale of drinking with a friend who happened to drink too much, claiming that he had no idea how Patricia had passed away. And after a night of innocent fun, he simply woke up the next day to find her dead beside him. He would then tell the police the same story. Investigators concluded that she had died from alcohol poisoning despite knowing that Mary Johns had died from the same cause at the same barbershop just 2 years earlier. And still, authorities refused to consider that foul play was involved. Murder through alcohol poisoning seemed like an absolutely ridiculous concept to them. So authorities ruled that Patricia's death was unnatural and accidental. On June 20, 1985, Patricia Andrew, aged 45 and a mother of 4, died at Jordan's barber shop. Patricia was an Indigenous woman with a known alcohol problem. The responding paramedics found a woman naked and unresponsive on the floor of the shop. She had an astonishing blood alcohol content of 0.79. That is 10 times the limit a person is deemed too drunk to drive. For her blood alcohol level to be that high, Patricia would have had to consume 40 ounces of hard liquor all at once. Jordan claimed that he and the woman had been binge drinking on Chinese cooking wine for days before she died. The coroner found signs of chronic alcohol abuse during the autopsy and ruled Patricia's death as accidental and unnatural, but not a homicide, even though she was the third woman found dead in Jordan's barbershop. And still, the idea that Gilbert was murdering women with booze was just too ridiculous for the police to accept. The authorities continued to believe that these women were unintentionally killing themselves. Around this time in trouble again for completely unrelated crimes. Gilbert Paul Jordan was trying to tell the court that he had turned his life around. Jordan blamed booze for his poor life decisions and decided to start attending 12-step meetings. But he never managed to stop drinking for any significant period of time. At some point on September 24, 1986, Gilbert met 38-year-old Velma Gibbons. She was an Indigenous woman who had been living at the Balmoral Hotel. After separating from her husband Ken, the two had split because of Velma's excessive drinking, which made her the perfect target for the boozing barber. Early that morning, she called her estranged husband and told him that she was working on her sobriety and asked him to pick her up. The next day was their son's birthday and she wanted to give him a present in person. Velma sounded sober over the phone, so he agreed. The details of what happened next are largely unknown, but on September 20th, 586, Velma Dora Gibbons, age 38, was found dead and semi-nude in a room at the sketchy Balmoral Hotel on Vancouver's Skid Row. She had died with a blood alcohol content of 0.63, and Chinese cooking wine was the only alcohol found in the room. Her death once again was ruled accidental due to acute alcohol poisoning. She had been seen with Gilbert Paul Jordan only hours leading up to her death. Considering the room had been cleared of all booze, there was good reason to suspect foul play. However, due to Velma's established unhealthy relationship with alcohol and an overall lack of evidence, authorities once again ruled the death accidental. Whether Gilbert was feeling invincible and he thought he never would get caught or he just got sloppy, we'll never really know. Veronica Norma Henry, age 33, was found dead in November 1986. In a room rented by Jordan at the Clifton Hotel. Her blood alcohol was only 0.4. Pathologists ruled her death to be accidental, even though she had fresh cuts and bruises on her face. She too had also been seen with Jordan on the day of her death. Gilbert, of course, placed a call to his lawyer and spun the same tale. Then the two of them told the police the same story that they had told multiple times. They claimed that Veronica had died of alcohol poisoning while Gilbert was asleep. And incredibly, police believed the story again and ruled the death as unnatural and accidental. So, according to local Indigenous groups, Gilbert counted on a very limited point of view. To ensure his freedom, he selected vulnerable and marginalized women who police were less likely to investigate due to their race and their drinking habits. Authorities didn't really show much compassion towards Indigenous women, and they cared even less about Indigenous women with drinking problems. The death of Vanessa Lee Buckner would be his undoing. The two of them would consume multiple bottles of vodka, and Gilbert left the hotel room several times to head to the liquor store to buy more booze. When he returned from the store, he would then force more alcohol down her throat. He also sexually assaulted Vanessa, although it's not known whether she was awake or not. In all likelihood, she was unconscious. But Gilbert made Vanessa drink far more than any of the other previous women. On October 12, 1980, 727-year-old Vanessa Lee Buckner was found naked and dead with a near-impossible blood alcohol content of 0.91%. She was suffering so badly from the effects of alcohol poisoning that black bile was oozing out of her nose and mouth. Her mother, who was a nurse, and her father, who was the owner of a construction company, didn't believe that their daughter had accidentally overdosed on alcohol, even though she was known to live a high-risk lifestyle. 4 years, Vanessa had been struggling with addiction to drugs and alcohol. However, on the day of her death, she seemed happy. She was talking to her parents about the future. She had just given birth to a child. Only 2 weeks before, Gilbert Paul had called to anonymously report Vanessa's death from his room at the nearby Marble Arch Hotel. Police traced the call, picked up Jordan, and then questioned him. And even though his story didn't make any sense whatsoever, the police would release him. However, after Jordan was let go, Vancouver Police Department homicide investigators finally began to look back at all the alcohol deaths that seemed to be connected with him. After examining Vanessa, her blood alcohol content was 0.91%, more than 11 times the legal limit for driving. To put this into perspective, how much booze this poor girl consumed, it was enough to kill a large man twice. To reach that level of toxicity, it didn't seem likely that this was an accidental overdose. Vanessa Buckner had most likely been murdered, and whoever reported her death was most likely the culprit. Gilbert was immediately questioned by police, but due to lack of evidence, they were unable to charge him with a crime. Murder by alcohol still seemed absolutely ludicrous, but they couldn't completely deny the suspicious circumstances. And so the authorities would claim that Vanessa Buckner had died from acute alcohol poisoning. Unnatural yet accidental. Vanessa Buckner's parents were livid. While they acknowledged that their daughter was a sex worker with a drug problem, they insisted she had never really been much of a drinker. There was no possible way she could have done this to herself. Vanessa's parents knew the man who had made the anonymous phone call had to be the person responsible for their daughter's death. They kept up the pressure for the authorities to take a deeper look into Gilbert Paul Jordan. Finally, in early November of 1987, the police department, the Crown Council, the coroner's office and several forensic pathologists gathered together to open up an investigation into Gilbert's past and to begin monitoring him as soon as possible. Unfortunately, while they were waiting for the author's radiation to start surveillance, Gilbert attacked yet another woman. In November 8, Gilbert met 53-year-old Edna Shield. Unlike his previous victims, Edna wasn't known to have any vices. She was beloved by her community. She spent time helping sex workers get off Skid Row and return to school. She lived in a single room in the Beacon Hotel. It was there her lifeless body was found. On November 9th, Edna was naked and her blood alcohol level was 0.77. Although there were no witnesses that saw Jordan enter the room, witnesses had seen her with Gilbert Bulge earlier in the day. Police suspected that the boozing Barber was behind her death. When they dusted for fingerprints, they found Gilbert's prints all over the crime scene. Unfortunately, the existence of Gilbert's prints alone was not enough to charge him with a crime for the rest of November. Cops immediately put Jordan under surveillance and watched him as he trolled for new victims on Vancouver's Skid Row. Police monitored Gilbert's every move. They'd watch him strike up conversations with Indigenous women on the street and buy them drinks in bars. On the evening of November 20th, police had to intervene 4 times to stop what they believed were another 4 attempts at poisoning Indigenous women. Gilbert met Rosemary Wilson in the bar of a Vancouver hotel. Rosemary thought Gilbert looked like a schoolteacher and trusted him instantly. She agreed to follow the mild-mannered Barber for drinks at the Baltimore hotel. But as long as Rosemary was conscious and still talking, there really wasn't much investigators could do without giving away their position. And so they stood by while Gilbert continued to ply Rosemary with alcohol. Apparently, listening to this was excruciating, but they were given orders not to intervene unless her life was in danger. At some point, the room fell silent and the police assumed that the couple had just fallen asleep. They started to pack up their equipment, but just as they opened the door to the hallway, Rosemary let out a piercing scream. Police charged into the room would grab Rosemary and take her immediately to the hospital. After she recovered, Rosemary learned that she almost died. She couldn't remember anything from the night before with Gilbert. The only thing that stood out in her memory was him shoving a bottle of vodka in her mouth and basically forcing her to chug it. He never even gave her a chance to breathe. It was apparent that Gilbert had nefarious motives, but paying a woman to drink herself to death still wasn't seen as a crime. Police would save 3 more women from similar circumstances. In one instance, authorities entered Gilbert's hotel room to find him on top of an unconscious woman. He was gripping her neck, kissing her mouth and pouring alcohol down her throat. Up until this point, authorities hadn't been able to picture how Gilbert was actually killing these women. But that all changed when they walked in and witnessed the act for themselves. Now the idea of murder by booze doesn't seem so crazy after all. Authorities took the woman to the hospital and arrested Gilbert for the murder of Vanessa Buckner. The officers on the scene noted that Gilbert did not seem concerned about the charges. In the end, this would be his first and only homicide charge. In 1988, the court convicted Gilbert Paul Jordan of manslaughter rather than first-degree murder, because the Crown was able to prove that he was negligent in Vanessa Lee's death. They did not show significant proof that he intended to kill her. The judge would sentence the 57-year-old career criminal and suspected serial killer to 15 years in prison. But the boozing Barber wasn't happy to stay in prison for very long and he appealed the ruling and got his sentence reduced to 9 years. And thanks to his good behavior behind bars, he was released after only serving 6 years in prison. Gilbert Paul Jordan was released at the age of 62 in 1994. The parole board defended its position by saying that Gilbert was getting what they called a one-chance statutory release. Although he was allowed to live his life as normal during the day, he would be required to spend his nights at jail for the next 3 years. He was not allowed to drink, and if he violated these terms just once, he would be put back in prison. Surprisingly, Gilbert lasted a whole 2 years without violating his parole. But that all changed on Sunday, August 4, 1996, when he didn't return to the correctional facility in time for his curfew. As soon as the clock struck midnight, authorities issued a nationwide warrant for his arrest. He was incarcerated again after failing to meet his parole conditions, which included avoiding any licensed establishments in the Vancouver downtown and the company of any women where liquor was served. Then, in November of 1997, Gilbert was officially released from parole. Gilbert maintained his good behavior for a short while. He had appeared to have turned over a new leaf. He finally managed to curb his addiction to alcohol and had become a law-abiding citizen. But by the summer of 1998, Gilbert had returned to his old ways. On June 23, 1998, he chatted up a woman at a local park. Gilbert invited her back to his apartment where he held her against her will and sexually assaulted her. Gilbert would be arrested for this and later acquitted because the woman was a known heroin addict and Gilbert's defense attorney would question the truth to the allegations, due to her shaky testimony. And once again, Gilbert evaded justice by choosing a vulnerable, marginalized woman as his victim. In June of 2068-year-old Gilbert was charged with administering a noxious substance to a woman and sexually assaulting her. The substance, of course, was alcohol. Unfortunately, in late October, the charges against Gilbert were stayed. The Crown simply didn't have enough evidence to prosecute. Around this same time, final rehearsals were taking place for a new play called The Unnatural and Accidental Woman. The play was written and directed by a woman named Mary Clemens. After seeing so much coverage about Gilbert Paul Jordan, Mary wanted to give a voice to the victims who were all Indigenous women like herself. The play opened to critical acclaim and Gilbert was thrown back into the spotlight to face public scrutiny. In response, Gilbert agreed to his first face-to-face interview with a journalist. Sadly, Gilbert refused to admit to any crime, although I can't say I'm surprised. He denied or minimized most of the crimes he'd been accused of and blamed everything wrong he's ever done on alcohol. When he was confronted about Vanessa Buckner or any of the other deceased Indigenous women connected to him, Gilbert insisted he was innocent. He pointed out that he was the one who had reported their deaths to the police, as if that made a difference in the matter. Shortly after the piece was published, Gilbert would be arrested for drinking with a rider in a restricted part of the city in May of 2000. And 169-year-old Gilbert would receive a 15-month sentence to be followed by a strict 3-year probation period. He served 2/3 of his punishment before being released. On February 2002, Gilbert would be arrested again for drinking with a woman in Vancouver's downtown Eastside neighborhood. He was sentenced to another year in jail for breaching the conditions of his probation. Another woman with Jordan came dangerously close to dying of alcohol poisoning in the York Hotel in Swift Current, Saskatchewan, in August 2004. Barb Buckley was an alcoholic and a resident of the low-rent hotel, and she required hospitalization and almost died after a night of binge drinking with Jordan. Afterwards, Jordan headed west. 2 days later, he was picked up by police and held on suspicion of attempted murder. A long-time career criminal, Jordan was not talking to the police, and Barb had been too intoxicated to give a clear statement, so police let Jordan go, citing the lack of evidence to proceed with criminal charges. Jordan returned to BC, and he was in and out of prison pretty much for the remainder of his life for various offenses, mainly parole violations. Finally, in July of 2006, Gilbert Paul Jordan would pass away, allegedly from cirrhosis of the liver. He died alone in Victoria, British Columbia. He had finally drank himself to death. In the article that was published in November of 2000, he minimalized his involvement in the woman's death, saying that these women were on their last legs. Not wanting to take any responsibility for his crimes, he added, "I'm not a criminal, but I have a terrible criminal record because of booze." Jordan's choice of victim is, sadly, much more common than his murder weapon. Marginalized women who are drug addicts and alcoholics often support themselves with sex work, and more often than not, they are easy targets for serial killers globally. Jordan chose his victims from Vancouver's notorious downtown Eastside, and they were almost all exclusively of Indigenous heritage. The same downtown area where Jordan chose his victims later gained notoriety thanks to another serial killer. Port Coquitlam pig farmer Robert Willie Picton also chose from the same pool of victims, and killed as many as 49 women between 1983 and 2002. Sadly, because of a lack of understanding and empathy about addiction, these women, who are often society's most vulnerable, tend to be easy pickings for predators like Jordan. These factors allowed him to go on killing relatively undetected for years. Why do you think society often turns a blind eye to crimes committed against marginalized communities, especially Indigenous women? What changes need to happen in law enforcement and the justice system to better protect vulnerable individuals from predators like Jordan and Picton? Do you think media coverage plays a role in how quickly or seriously authorities respond to cases involving marginalized victims? Why or why not? What are some ways society can provide better support for women struggling with addiction to prevent them from becoming easy targets for serial killers? How do you feel about the justice system's handling of Jordan's crimes? Should he have been convicted of more than manslaughter? Let me know your thoughts on this disturbing case. If you want to hear more real-life crime stories like this, follow and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next one.